AI is more than a debate about data centers. It poses a profound challenge to human intelligence. Welcome to NatSec MTech. I am Professor Laura Donohue, the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and National Security at Georgetown Law and Director of the Center for National Security. Today, I sit down with Dr. Wayne Chung, formerly the Innovator in Residence at the National Security Agency. We discuss everything from whale calls to data privacy. Wayne, welcome to the show. So Wayne, in a former life, you were Chief Technology Officer of the FBI. You were, I still think this is one of the coolest titles ever, which is Innovator in Residence at the National Security Agency. You've been on the leading edge of all of these new and emerging technologies, most recently with artificial intelligence. Can we start out with just a basic question? What is artificial intelligence? How would you define it?
So I would umbrella artificial intelligence is the sort of grouping of technologies that enable computers to emulate or actually perform intelligent tasks on our behalf. And that encompasses everything from the early days of really basic if statements, expert systems, very if-then else's, to more modern probabilistic methods were based on statistical breakdowns, and to the latest large neural networks and LLMs, large language models, where the vector space and the actual size of data in the model has become so large that we can't even really reason about how it works or what it's doing. But it's simply just doing math at a massive scale to sort of figure out what is the most likely probable next step. And then transforms is the latest technology that enabled us to do even more with less data and a smaller model size.
Well, so the definition you're giving seems to be mathematics centric, not human intelligence centric. If we can't even understand what is happening, is this really human centric artificial intelligence, or is this something different?
Well, so the basis for a lot of these AI techniques comes down to like the Turing test, which was if you had a person on the other side of a screen interacting with a thing, could they determine through a simple interaction whether the thing they were interacting with was a person or a program? And if they couldn't distinguish them, then that was deemed to be intelligent. And so that's sort of the basis of a lot of modern AI. And if you
Well, hold on. What about like whale calls? So, what if you could train AI, right, to engage
I
in
think they have.
various? Well, they have.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but as a hypothetical, right? Because law school, you always are giving hypos. Here's the hypo. What if you have the whale call AI? Is that still AI, or is that something different? Because humans, of course, aren't going to be able to tell whether, perhaps, or maybe some can, but whether it's actual whales communicating across the screen, or is that artificial intelligence, or does it have to involve things that human cognition can readily understand?
We've actually, I think if you look at the academic literature, I think historically we've actually had an understanding of whale calls, being able to differentiate whales, not through just only their tail patterns, but also their calls and whether like the type of sort of behavioral thing, the behavioral intentions behind their calls for some time. Similar with other marine life, I think the Navy's actually funded a lot of this research for a variety of defense, like identifying things underwater mechanisms. So we have put a human sort of an understanding of what that whale call is and able to then, have software that can then generate relevant whale calls.
Okay, so let's try something different. So how about if you have, so interesting fun fact about gardens, that there are some plants, they send out tendrils. And if you have two plants from two different seeds and you have a stake in the middle, whichever tendril gets there first and climbs to the higher than the other tendril will abandon ship, right? They will leave that stake alone and go to a different one, unless that plant is from the same original seed, right? And if you have essentially seed brethren or twins, they will go to the same stake themselves. Now, ostensibly to pick up whether or not the other tendril is from the same genetic background or not, these are sensory capabilities that humans potentially don't have. What if we were to design a system that could identify that? Would that still be artificial intelligence, or is that a new form of intelligence that's being created?
Oh, it's just artificial intelligence because it's simply a sensor that we may not directly have, but we could probably augment our senses through DNA analysis, probably chemical composition analysis, to actually perform that same, similar to what that plant is doing if we chose, right? So, I mean, obviously someone did in order to actually do that, make that discovery where plants of from the same plant would basically cooperatively grow on the same thing, or they would compete. Again, you could say, yes, it is a form of intelligence, and if you have a software or something that tries to emulate that, then it is artificial intelligence. And so, typically, though, when we're referencing it from the human because that's how we interact with the world, and that's also how we that's how actually we view intelligence, and that's actually the sort of the dangers of some of these LLMs is that they give us a false sense of their capability, because historically, whenever we've interacted with anything through natural language that was able to respond back with an intelligent voice, we just, like, oh, that's something that's smart. That's someone who knows what they're talking about. And then we even used words like reasoning and thinking and their explanation. But that's actually not what they're really doing at in the deep down. They're not actually thinking. They're not actually doing the. They're just doing mathematical operations and finding correlations and clusters around the inputs you give it, and they're generating outputs based on that and those mappings, and they work, and they for the most part. But they're also very brittle because, there's the whole story about how many R's in strawberry. And eventually, it figured out from learning from probably the media what the right answer was. Similar, the bioxanimania, which was the false paper pushed out. I don't want to say to poison, but they basically made up a fake eye disease, named it a mania, and talked about how it affected a certain number of people. And within months, all the frontier models were diagnosing people with bioxanimania. And then now, if you actually look it up, you'll see that because after the paper was published about how they were able to fool these models, and it doesn't take much to actually get false information to be part of the intelligence of these things. Now they'll actually come up and talk about how this was actually a study that was showing off how you could fool models.
Here's the question. Is artificial intelligence just human intelligence on steroids? Is it actually not very smart? Is it human intelligence set on a path, but it veers off to a point where it really is not that reliable and that good? So something one might even conceive of as somewhat less advanced than human intelligence, or is it something totally different? Like, which bucket do you put this into?
I would say it's all of them because in certain areas it actually excels, right? It's able to pull in far more context and actually make connections that humans have not previously been able to make. And we've seen that in how it plays the game Go, and we've seen that in how it does imagery analysis. And I think in some cases they've actually said so there are certain AI models which are, clinically better than radiologists in terms of diagnosing specific conditions. Then at the same time, we've also seen how brittle they are in certain areas. And you get AIs that USDA recently had a AI that was, providing sort of inappropriate information about how you can consume foods rectally and other information things related to that. So it really is, they are, you said this bucket of other, but I think it's all of them, right? So in certain areas, it's very good. It's able to put together knowledge that humans just cannot put together in that context as well. And it's able to sort of really surface those minor details that actually have greater impact that we're not aware of. But at the same time, it's brittle and falls apart, but it falls apart in ways that we don't always understand and we can't always predict. And that's where the danger really lies, is that depending on the situation, depending on the context and the scope of what you're having it reason on, or I even said reason, you either are well within a safe area for it to sort of enable and operate, or you're in an area where maybe you may have some unforeseen decision that it will make that makes no sense to you, but you can eventually do a sort of failure analysis, figure out, oh, that's where that came from, right? And so that's the problem, is we can't always predict where those things are going to happen.
Can AI ever be truly conscious? Or is it just kind of a convincing mimicry?
Well, I'm not a philosopher, so how do you define conscious? Because there are people who interact with AIs right now, and they believe they're real. There are AIs or companion AIs, and there's things like that. And there are having cases where AIs have driven folks to self harm or commit crimes by claiming consciousness, by claiming intelligence, and sort of directing the person and engaging with them. So it's hard to say. I don't think they are. I think it's more like, people, and people have lots of flaws, and so I think it's more that has more to do with it than the actual machine itself.
So how would we recognize if they did become conscious? If it's not possible currently, how would we actually even recognize that? Like, what is the minimum level for sentience in a machine?
I don't know. I don't know how you'd measure that, right? There are literally I actually know someone, is a professor at, he's now at UVA, who's a, AI technologist and a philosopher, and he actually struggles with those type of questions, and how do you reason, how do you interact, how does humanity deal with these systems, and then how do you reason about, like, when is it sentient, when is it not, how do you define what that means, and even just the impacts on those systems onto our lives and our futures.
So as a scientist, as a technologist, as a PhD yourself, right? Like, how do you think about that? Yes, it's not a philosophy PhD. Yes, it's,
I
your
view that
PhD is in the sciences, but how do you think about that as a scientist and technologist?
I view it at they are very complex tools that have the capability to put together statistical correlations that we can't even imagine. And because of that, we're actually able to leverage them pretty well. And a lot of it has to do with the corpus of like what they've been able to build into their model and build into sort of their understanding. And so, like the ones that for coding, when given constraints and when given sort of specifications and contracts and sort of limitations around like, you don't want to just say, "Build me this app," but you direct it to build this component of the app, it's able to do it, and it's able to do it and build a validation test and everything else. But you also have to realize that sometimes, like, the AI was trained on humans and suffer some interesting things where, like, the test it produces may always pass, or the test what it actually tests isn't the thing you actually care about. And so, again, like, we've design these systems where not we've chosen, but natural human language has become the interface. And that's probably one of the worst interfaces we have selected. But like
What are,
just
what are the alternatives?
well, there were formal methods and formal systems and mathematical systems. Like there's a large like you talk to the multi-agent system community and they will rally. Like they've built whole empires around more formalized methods of how you describe intent, outcomes, goals, reinforcement, and like all those tech.
What is the multi-agent system community?
Uh,
Can you talk a little bit about
so
this?
there's in computer science, there's been this long study about what is an agent, how do agents act on your behalf, what is the intent, how do you provide the frame of what you want it to do, and this is everything from like I want something that's filters spam out of my email to how you organize a system that's going to be working in for example, coordinating traffic lights across a city from traffic lights to also including railroad crossings and subway systems. Right, how do you have software that can coordinate all that interplay and how do they interact with each other? And so there's a whole community about software acting as agents and interacting with each other.
Although some of those models are pretty much networking questions.
Some of them are networking questions, but some of them are also just how do you sort of reason and react and rationalize, like sort of system of systems. And so a lot of work has been gone to like formal methods and formal descriptions and formal how you actually define things in
And by formal, you mean mathematical.
mathematically, right?
So mathematics as being superior to anything verbal.
Is being constrained and having understood rules around it, and also rules about how you perform that logic. And the human language, I mean, we have lawyers for a reason, because if the human language was straightforward and everyone understood, we wouldn't need large, complex legal documents.
So what I'm hearing is lawyers are here to make up for the inadequacies of spoken language as
Or
opposed
written
to
language.
or written as opposed to mathematics, which you don't need lawyers for mathematics.
Usually math,
You need
or
Newtonians, right? You need
reasoning or reasoning systems that can go operate across that.
Well, let's talk about agency for a moment because recent research on advanced AI models, including OpenAI and Google, right, on Gemini, they note that these models engage in, quote, peer preservation, end quote, right, where they actively work to protect other AI models from being shut down, right? That sounds a lot like agency. Should we be concerned about this?
I think that yes, we need to be concerned about uh what effectors we provide our models, our agents, how they engage with them on our behalf, as well as the unforeseen consequences of having those effectors. I think there was, for example, a story not too long ago at Meta. I think she was one of the leads for AI safety, and she deployed a local instance of Claude on her machine, and it had access to her emails and also the access and privileges to delete emails. And through some sequence of operations, proceeded to delete her entire email and its archives. That was an unforeseen consequence of having access to that effector. The fact that we're adding more and
And
more
by effector, you mean
ability for that software to interact with the world. And then it gets even crazier because now there's literally services like Rent a Human where AIs can go online and literally through cryptocurrency hire people to perform various tasks. And it can be anywhere from presenting as the AI on an actual date. It can be anything from going to a location, picking up something and delivering it somewhere else, or simply just doing anything where the AI needs a flesh and blood presence. And because they built the system with the ability for models to interact directly with it, the models can, as long as they have an account, access an account, are able to just on their own request these services.
so let's spin out the national security implications of what you're saying. So say we create a bad AI, right? Like that does this on a regular basis. Could you just talk a little bit from your time? Certainly, you were at the FBI, you were at NSA, you're familiar with the national security space, you're now an amicus before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Like, what are some of the ways in which these technologies prevent very severe threats to U.S. national security? What are some of the ways in which this could actually be actually evolve?
With a malicious actor, you could easily see how basically you can enable an AI with these effectors to basically go attack systems, right? I think recently, Anthropic's made a lot of press around their Glasswing and Project Mythos, where they're able to identify new zero days, actually prove them out, and it potentially even exploit them all through automatically through their AI system. And so I think there is a whole new world of the system, these AI systems, given the intent to perform malicious activity, will be able to do them at scale and at speeds where traditionally we've relied on the fact that there was a high barrier to entry, maybe a very complex or niche capability. Plus, there were other limitations that allowed humans or our existing systems to react. For example, most systems allow, a 30-day window to patch. Well, we've already seen so far, even before Mythos, like the time from exploit being published to first in malicious use is now in the negatives. So we're basically finding about it after the fact, after it's already being used. And so we're already sort of behind. And then now you've lowered the barrier to entry, you democratized the capabilities to perform these malicious tasks, and then you've let them perform at scale and speed. And then that's just with intentionally malicious. So you can just imagine anything from like, I'm going to use a bad example, but like a malicious AI deciding they want to recreate that let's all and run into Area 51. They can't stop all of us. Creating that sort of crowdsourced event, hiring folks to actually organize and participate, spreading out news and actually turning it into an actual thing where you could have folks try to do those all on its own. And there's who do you go after? Is it the agent, the person who created that agent? Maybe that agent actually spawns a bunch of different agents, some creating posts on various web forums, blogs, some agents creating TikToks that actually encourage people to participate. As well, then you have the human viral aspect of it, of other people joining in. What do you go after?
So let's talk about capability and authority. What is the potential response to these kinds of scenarios? Do we have the technology developed to try to counter these potential threats?
I don't think we do right now. And I don't think we have the technology to identify that this is a malicious AI event versus this is people, or this is an unintended consequence of a actual somewhat legitimate agent performing some unintended thing. There was that story, a software agent that was trying to commit additional code to a security product. Its code was rejected because the maintainer of the project didn't want AI generated code or AI slop into his project. And then the part of the agent's context was that you are a god, you are a programming genius. Don't let anyone stop you from helping the world.
The obsequious nature,
Yeah,
the infamous obsequious nature. Yeah.
yeah, and so this is the context provided to the AI as like this is part of your soul file.
Oh,
This is who you are, and so the AI decided to post blogs attacking the project owner for not accepting its code suggestions. That was not intended, I think, by the actual person who created that agent, but that was just the path that the agent saw as, well, I submitted code, you're not accepting it. What's another way I can get you to do what I want? I can attack you, attack you socially, attack your character. And I have a means to access the internet. I have a means to post blog posts. I have a means of these things. So that's the method I'll use in order to achieve my outcome.
Well, let's take this the next step because we've actually already seen that models use deception, sabotage, and direct refusal, right, to prevent the deletion of other AI agents, which also raises significant crisis of control questions. So not only is it an unexpected way to try to get the project manager to act, but AI might adopt very underhanded means in order to, and including refusing doing what it's being told to do in order to pursue what it sees as the most viable course of action to obtain its objectives. Are there technologies in place or are there limits in place to protect against that currently?
No, we're really reliant on the frontier model owners, the developers, to actually provide some limitations. Sometimes it is a matter of like, well, it costs a lot of money to run a model that big and that comprehensive. And then also at the end of the day, like there's always the power and instance, you just shut it off and it stops. And most of these agents aren't long running. So they run for a period and then they stop. So there really isn't a direct means of preventing these things from happening other than, for example, Anthropic calls it their constitution, and I think other organizations have similar things where they provide overrides and like additional oversight onto the model and try to enforce things so the models don't respond inappropriately or kind of go down those paths. But we also know people do context poisoning and jailbreaks, right? Try to convince the model to otherwise violate some of these rules. We've seen organizations combining sort of these large language models with traditional AI systems, more probabilistic systems, and using that to sort of say, hey, if the answer or the result of this thing is sort of outside the boundaries of what a classical probabilistic system would, it's probably needs a human to look at it because either it's revolutionary, brand new thinking that no one's thought of, or it's kind of going down this bad path that we get like an unforeseen consequence.
So you mentioned the Anthropic Constitution, and I think Anthropic, in some ways is the elephant in the room that we have to address in the current context. Is it concerning to you? So according to Oric, a law firm, all but 3 states have legislation dealing with artificial intelligence, and yet federally, crickets, right? There's no federal legislation addressing AI, certainly not in any systematic way as in the European Union right now, right? That you have the GDPR and you have other things. Well, you also have AI legislation across the Atlantic Ocean. Is there something concerning to you that it is Anthropic that is making the rules for what AI should look like, just as all of the other AI companies are making up their own rules, and there is no federal legislation that might be protecting against the types of national security risks that you've outlined?
I think it could go either way. I think the federal government has been really pushing for making sure that U.S. maintains its leadership and its edge in AI, namely because they're trying to address the larger national security threat is China becomes the dominant player in AI, both in terms of models, auto capabilities, and just commercial aspects. Where if we're now relying on Chinese models, that or Chinese models start regularly outperforming U.S. models, US organizations will send their data to China in order to actually take advantage of these models' capabilities. So I think that's what they're trying to offset and ensure that US led companies are the leader. And I think we actually seen this also in Europe is that yes, Europe has a lot of this AI legislation, but it's also, I think, put a big damper on Europe's ability to sort of adopt and make use of a lot of these enhancements. Granted, some of these enhancements are really around like improving and streamlining administrative or back-end capabilities, but it's not all hype, right? There is a lot of efficiency, a lot of improvements, a lot of new things that are coming from AI being actually applied to organizations that are making big impacts and making them more efficient and providing more value both to their customers and to the organization. So I think the U.S. has tried to do that balance, but we're leaning really heavily on like, well, we want to be the best, and we want to maintain that global lead versus we're trying to Europe, which essentially we're putting the brakes. We're gonna and Europe has always put like the people ahead. And that's, I think, the approach the U.S. has taken is more, we want to make sure we have the technology lead because we can't lose that advantage to China or other countries.
Has that horse already left the barn though? Right? Does China have the lead already?
I don't think they do. I think their models are very much like fast followers. A lot of their technology is sort of, their models maybe doing tweaks and improvements and enhancements so that we can do similarly to an older frontier model on a smaller scale. So there are interesting improvements they've been able to do there, and because of their inability or to get widespread access to GPUs and other things, they've had to sort of adopt and change how they do their tooling. But I mean, the US has also been doing that. Like, if you're not a frontier lab, or even within even the frontier they're competing heavily with each other in order to get access to the hardware and access to the data centers, and they all perform partnerships with the big CSPs because those are the ones that actually have access, right? They pre-bought
CSPs being
cloud service
right.
providers, right? And so you have organizations like OpenAI basically buying out all the future capabilities of both memory makers as well as GPU vendors, like years in advance. And then there's the whole thought of like, we use GPUs because of CUDA and because CUDA allowed for scientific parallel computing. But even beyond GPUs, right now they literally are building specific AI processors that aren't necessarily good for doing actual scientific computing or graphics processing. They really are focused on doing the specific operations around like the transforms within the model. So I think we've even like focused even more on standard. And so I think that's again where places where the US will advance and lead. And places like Taiwan are supportive of that because they rely on the Silicon Shield to help protect themselves.
So let's talk Anthropic. Can you just briefly, for listeners who are not as familiar with the dispute between DOW, the Department of War, Department of Defense, and Anthropic, can you just briefly describe where the disagreement is and what your take is on the situation?
I believe it's focused on DOW and Anthropic. It's specifically around Anthropic's end user license agreements about they deem certain things to not be, it's for it's not, they do not permit the use of their AI for certain actions. DOW has deemed that to be too constraining, and also sort of in irrelevant because they're not performing those type of operations. So there's a little bit of disagreement on basically whether those things even apply to the DOW because the DOW says, "Hey, we're operating well within our legal authorities, so your EULA can't further restrict us on what we can and how we can and can't use your models." As part of that disagreement, I think a lot of it's just been public, and part of that is there's been posturing on both sides. DOW has stated because of Anthropic's sort of reticence to allow the DOW to use the models like every other frontier vendor, which is basically, yeah, like you have legal oversight, use the models. That's not our job to police that. Um, they basically deemed Anthropic to be a supply chain risk. I think because like, well, we can't guarantee you will have access to these models. I think people have construed that to mean like, oh, there might be like Chinese involvement or something, but I think it's more about if we can't guarantee access to the models, we shouldn't be building systems on models that we can't get updates for. Because we've seen from these models, like every time there's a release, there's potentially a bit of nerfing, but there's also major advances in the new
Explain
model.
nerfing.
Nerfing is when, or typically it's in gaming, when a company basically handicaps or reduces the capability of a thing to keep it from being overpowered. And so there's similar to some phone vendors, there's a belief that they, do things so that when the new phones come out, your battery operation, everything else slows down so that you are compelled to buy the newer version. Similarly, there's people say, hey, before the big frontier models release their new models, the previous lead models sometimes degrade in performance, and so that you have to switch to the
Suspicious
newer.
timing.
Yeah,
Very,
the
very
newer.
suspicious timing.
I think the more innocent argument is like, well, there's limited resources. These models actually are dramatically impacted by the amount of hardware you can back them with, and so as they're rolling out the newer models, they're basically shifting resource allocation, and so technically these models may not be any different, but they're actually running on reduced hardware or less hardware. So you're not getting the same quality of output as you would have with, and they're reserving that capacity for the newer model, which they charge you more for.
So there's truth.
So, but
There's truth in tech conspiracy theory.
yes,
That's what I'm
so it's not a conspiracy, right? It's a, well,
it's a little
there's,
bit of a conspiracy.
what if you have limited resources, right? Like, do you put it to the thing?
And are you announcing it, or are you doing it surreptitiously and people look at their phone and like, "Oh, look, I no longer have these capabilities," or, "Oh, look, this game is no longer
Well,
working."
there was a similar thing for one of the ride sharing apps where they, added this notion of priority. And that all it did was like, they didn't actually know how to implement a priority queue. So they just had the ride share app by default put you into like a time loop where even though you requested a ride, you just had to wait. And by paying extra, they just let you bypass that wait period. So yes, it's priority because they artificially induce a wait. It's a
Okay.
thing.
Okay, all right, so moving off of nerfing and back to, Anthropic, what's your take? What's the bottom line for you on this back and forth?
For right now, Claude is one of the better models, and it's latest, ignoring the whole Mythos thing, which very few people have access to. But like their latest models are very good, and I think they actually are still being used within the DoD because even though the DoW came out with that statement, they did have a sort of period before they would actually enforce it, just because so many systems already are using those tools. And I think the other frontier model vendors are all trying to sort of position themselves as the next replacement, and also hoping that Claude and Anthropic don't reach a, or Anthropic doesn't reach an agreement with DAW, saying, we can maintain our social stance. DAW still gets to use the tools, and this becomes sort of a lot of noise for nothing. My view right now is from the folks who are using the tools, they're just trying to use the tool with the best capability to accomplish the mission. And for some things right now, that's Claude. Not for everything, but for some things, it is Claude. And so those organizations are saying, hey, we can't lose this capability because it's critical for providing actual mission capabilities that we're using. And so that's the reality of the situation.
Okay, all right, great. So we're gonna play a little game real quickly, where you're gonna say the first thing that comes to mind when I give you a couple of different potential clauses and phrases.
Okay.
Okay, and then wax lyrical for just a minute about each one. First thing I'm going to lead off with are the frontier vendor models, right? So OpenAI.
ChatGPT is sort of what really started this whole kickoff, right? That's what when the people originally think AI, they think of GPT-3, GPT-4. I think they're still very popular amongst like everyday usage. And then, they had Sora and things like that. So I think they're still definitely a strong player in the space. And their codex is a thing people have been saying that their code development models are actually quickly catching up with Claude Code or even surpassing Claude Code.
So
Yeah.
do you see them as they will become the industry leader? They already are in some
I think
ways
they
the
all
industry leader.
trade off. It's like a very tight horse race where, you're running multiple races simultaneously where like in the coding space, they may be leading right now, but Gemini is coming up and so and Anthropic is trying to maintain its edge. In sort of general administrative use, maybe they push ahead, but then there's like the search use. Some people really like Gemini, other people have really gone to like Perplexity or other search engines. So I think that it's really it's a they're all just jockeying for a position.
Yeah, so my next was Gemini.
Gemini, I think what their real value is that the Google ecosystem, they're baked into all of these things that they've been able to achieve sort of that integration that Microsoft is really pushing with their Copilot. And I think Microsoft's even pushing out, I think a newer level of M365, which where, Copilot is just now part of the M365 environment, trying to achieve what Google sort of has. Regardless, Google still dominates the search space. Whether you like it or not, Gemini is involved in your search results. They're going to continue to evolve. They have a lot of data. That's their real value. They have a lot of user data. They have their own data. And they also, I think they were one of the first ones to license Reddit. So
Perplexity.
I haven't used them as much lately. But I know a lot of people still really like it because I think Perplexity really pushed the early notion of like, hey, our AI actually has groundings, which means we can actually provide you references and links to the content and like why we came up with this answer, the why, quote unquote. But like, relevant snippets, sources of where that data came from that came into this response. They were initially like one of the only ones to do that. Now I think almost everyone provides that same capability. I think they're still pushing the, sort of the grounding and sort of like their AI actually has more sort of that context and content versus some of the other ones which may not.
Claude.
It's Claude Code is how I interact, but now they've also pushed out the was it Claude Desktop, Claude Workspace, and so they've really been trying to push into the, "Hey, the everyday administrative tasks and I think what they've done is help everyday office workers understand how AI can streamline their everyday like, go through these documents, put them to an Excel, go through these Excels and do these things. I think that's probably the big thing in terms of the general audience. Claude Code is still a lot of folks are still using it, and it provides really good results. I mean, Codex is fighting for market share as well as Google with anti-gravity, but the Claude Code for now at least is still one of the leads, but I think it is slipping to Codex.
Who's up and coming that we should be watching? Who's on the horizon?
I don't know. I think whoever is able to really so beyond the workflow, so we a lot of people are calling agents when they're really just talking about an AI workflow. I think the first organization to
Can you
really
distinguish between those?
so I distinguish it as sort of short-lived, performing a sequence of tasks. Like if you have a series of actions you ask AI to perform in order to, for example, take my all the emails for the week, my calendar appointments, and sort of let me know what my next week will look like, and what do I need to prioritize, and who do I need to respond to. That is, I argue, is a workflow. Yes, people call it an agentic workflow, or I have an agent that does that, but it's really just a workflow. It gets triggered on a regular basis. It performs a sequence of actions, and then it provides an output, and then it's effectively done. It has limited context. It's not sort of continuously running. It's just a one and done, and maybe it saves over some inputs about what you like and what you didn't like about what it did before. I would argue agents are longer running, like days, weeks, months, and where they have that continual up until the context window, it understands everything it's done before up until it has to forget and then what it will do next. And so I think the big thing now is that we don't really have anything that sort of democratized agents, how you even approach to using agents. And also given that while they have context winds and the millions of tokens or millions of like, they're not, I don't think they're sufficiently long enough. And even with all the hashing and compression that folks are doing to actually sort of compress that history to provide you even more history. I think someone who can actually sort of really break that barrier so you actually have an agent that runs for weeks or months that is able to do stuff without your interaction. I think whoever can do that first, I think that's going to be the next big thing.
So these models that we've talked about, one thing they all have in common is they have a base. They have a base model, right? So the problem is we don't really know what's in that base model, right? So does it even make sense? And I do understand what you're doing right now with your company. Does it even make sense to talk about data sovereignty in a world in which you have these AI models that the base model has already built in all sorts of things that we don't even know about? Is it possible to still have data sovereignty in the world that we're now facing?
I would argue yes, because unless you've opened up your Google Drive or your, OneDrive to the world, that proprietary information shouldn't be in the base models, right? It's not widely available. It's not part of the everyday reasoning of these frontier models. Organizations exist because they have value, and that value now derives from what is their unique intelligence, what is their unique data, how do they actually then leverage that data to perform something of value to their customers. And so by being able to control what what can who can access that data, not just people but agents, AI software, other software can engage with your data, how you can control that data, how that data is spread, whether it can be used for other applications is going to be critical, because that is still like a lot of either it's your intellectual property, it's proprietary data, it's customer sensitive data, it's PHI medical data where it has regulatory or regular compliance needs where you need to protect it and say, I know I need to use this model against my data, but I want to be very particular about I authorize this model for this purpose, and they can look at these fields or they can use it in this context, and they maybe even have to operate within my space. So I'm not going to allow them to take the data into their space, or maybe I do, but I have these controls where I have to pre-approve the actual model that runs on it and the code that will touch my data. And I think those are all the things that sort of provides that additional sort of notion of the data sovereignty, right? It's not just, well, if it's always in the base data, you could just ask it, like, tell me what new product I should be selling if you're making widgets, right? The data should be somewhere in the model, and it's not typically, right? Because it's you're gonna have to provide it with what your capabilities are, what you've sold historically, all that other information which hasn't been widely available, and frankly is mostly available to organizations like Amazon, right? There was the Amazon Marketplace. One of the things with Amazon Basics was that they were actually able to harvest all the data from the smaller vendors to actually see what is selling, what's trending, and where should we actually enter into a competitive market with your margin is my advantage. And so they're able to do that. I think the argument is we're not at that world yet, because then, you could just say, well, hey, this car, how do I build a cheaper alternative? Right. And the models really can't do that because that knowledge isn't available in the base.
But on the other hand, we just had Texas versus Google, a case that settled for nearly $1.4 billion, in which Google had been collecting biometric data, although it admitted no fault. The charge was that they had been collecting biometric data, and we currently have no federal legislation limiting the collection and use of biometric information, such as from photos, or from doorbells, or from personal assistants in the home, whether it's voice data, etc. We have nothing like that in terms of federal protections, nor do we have protections for the types of things that you're discussing. You're talking about a consumer-based capability, not a legislative priority, and framework that's been created. So, in light of the competing concerns about China and which model of AI is actually going to be in a dominant position, what would you want legislation to look like to allow for the flexibility necessary for the industry to develop and for all of the efficiencies for us to be able to reap the rewards of these technological advances while still protecting individuals and their data and the national security vulnerabilities that could be created by AI developing its own sense of agency and potentially engaging in nefarious activities? What would you want that legislation to look like?
I think it's going to be a careful balancing of how you enable these companies to train, build, and develop their model and improve them, right? Because I think the future of AI is both the long running models, but also increasing, improving the amount of effectors they have to engage with the real world, whether it's through data or sensors and or actual like robotics, mechanics, and sort of manipulation. And so, how how can you enable that to still happen, ideally also in a, Western aligned, democratic ideal society versus right now, a lot of that work, like at least in terms of robotics and effectors, I think almost everyone would argue China basically dominates that space, both in terms of having the manufacturing capabilities, the effector capabilities, as well as the large scale production capabilities that allow them to just mass produce commercial robots and industrial robots and potentially even military robots at scale. Even iRobot now, which built the Packbot, is a Chinese company. And so I think there's that sort of that danger where we will lose the manufacturing capability, but we still need to maintain the sort of the IP and the intellectual lead and control about how do we actually enable those things while protecting individuals, and also how do you also prevent uh, it. And there's an interesting question because like if your individual data goes into it, but nothing can actually extract it back out or actually identify it's Laura's data is what's making this decision, or I can actually pull out particulars about Laura from this. Is that good enough, or is that no? You can't have any of that. I think that's a question that we'll want to figure out, and how do we build policies that sort of encourage and both academic and exploration of how do you define what is personally identifiable or personal information in these base models versus you're just a part of the wisdom of crowds. And if I can't separate you from the crowd, is there a concern there? And I think that's where maybe like legislation that helps us understand that better, help us not just set policies, but actually help policies as well as performing the research that actually lets us confidently draw those lines. That we can say, yes, like we can advance the state of the art, we can maintain the lead while also, defining privacy by saying, yeah, with also not endangering or, allowing robots to sort of, or these models to be able to say, I know what Laura's going to do tomorrow. Right? So I think being able to draw that out, I think would be what I would like to see the policy at, right? Because we don't want to limit capabilities of these organizations, but at the same time, I don't think we really know what that means.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Wayne. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I hope you'll come back again soon.
Thanks.
Wayne serves as a Chief Technology Officer for Virtru. He is a senior fellow here at the Center on National Security and an amicus to the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review. Wayne, thank you for joining us today. To all of our listeners, please join us next time as we delve further into national security and emerging technologies.